Well, thank you all very much, and thank you, Fred, for coming. I really appreciate that. He's one of my favorite friends, so I'm sure it'll come out. I've got a lot to say, and I've only got 25 minutes. I'm going to go straight ahead. What is fortunate is that God designed humans, not the scientists. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that when scientists look at something, they'll see it through their own eyes, and they miss what's the obvious. So if we're going to talk about metabolism during exercise, this is where the body stores its fuels, either as carbohydrate in the liver or in muscle, or as triglycerides in the fat. And I spent 33 years or so studying carbohydrate metabolism from glycogen to lactate. For example, in muscle, I spent a whole lot of time studying how quickly you can absorb carbohydrate in the gut. And all the time, we were looking at carbohydrates, and we were forgetting about fat. And so on this diagram, you can see what's the focus. The focus is carbohydrate. Why? Because I was funded by the carbohydrate industry to prove carbohydrates make you run faster. So my bias was there. But when you actually look at the real picture, look where the energy is. That's where the energy is. So God must have designed it for a reason to put all that energy into fat and so little energy into carbohydrate. There must be a reason. So there it is. This is the comparison. This is how much energy you have in fat, and that's how much energy you have in carbohydrate. So when you just look at that, how do you think God designed us? To burn carbohydrate or to burn fat? Now what happened historically was that, it's been estimated that adipose tissue at stores alone can supply sufficient energy for nearly 4 days of running, compared to less than 2 hours using muscle glycogen stores. So there has to be a reason why that was so. Now, I spent, as I've said, years and years and years studying where the energy came from during exercise. So we had people exercise for 3 hours, and we measured exactly how much fat they burned, how much glucose, and how much muscle glycogen. And we studied them when they were non-loaded, and we studied them when they were carbohydrate loaded. And what you notice is when you're carbohydrate loaded, you burn much less fat. So you burn much more carbohydrate. So in hindsight, it seems that we wanted to prevent all fat oxidation. That was our goal, and we didn't realize it. Why would you want to stop all fat oxidation? But that's what happens if you prescribe carbohydrates. And we couldn't see that at the time, and many still don't understand that the more carbohydrate you eat, the less fat you're going to burn. So you're inhibiting the one fuel that is a huge amount in the body. So then we even went further, and we studied exogenous carbohydrate. That's carbohydrate that you take in by mouth, and then you can see that it replaces some of the endogenous carbohydrate. And again, the fat is not being burned. You're mainly burning carbohydrate. So the focus was and is on maximum carbohydrate use and sparing glycogen by increasing exogenous glucose delivery. But the best way to spare muscle glycogen is to burn more fat. But we couldn't see it. We were so ingrained to thinking that carbohydrate is everything that we just ignored the role of fat. And here, for example, we'll show you, this was an athlete I helped become one of the greatest athletes in South Africa. And this is 1981 when we were researching and helping him, and he said it's not possible for me to run my best in a long-distance race without ingesting a high-carbohydrate drink, especially for the last hours of the race. And we developed the first goo in the whole world was developed by myself and by him. And here it is. The Lepin Fordyce Rose Noakes Squeezy is the original carbohydrate syrup product available to endurance athletes. That's how history will remember the two of us as producing this carbohydrates. But we did one other study, which no one remembers. We did the only placebo-controlled carbohydrate loading study that has ever been done. And why don't people use placebo-controlled trials? Because they might get the answer they don't want. And this study was not funded by industry, so we could do some other things. And we gave the guys a placebo carbohydrate, and this is the performance over 100 kilometers. There was the time, and you will notice that there is no difference. This is the only carbohydrate-loaded trial that's ever been done with a placebo, and it showed no effect. So Fred's going to have to explain why carbohydrate loading. but let me show you my bias. This is how scientists are. This is now 2000, and this is what we write. This placebo-controlled trial showed that carbohydrate loading, and then I put it in capitals, did not improve performance during which carbohydrate was consumed. So you know what we said? It had to be the carbohydrate consumption that this destroyed the difference. By preventing any fall in blood glucose concentrations, carbohydrate ingestion may offset any detrimental effects of performance on lower pre-exercise muscle glycogen and liver glycogen concentrations. So we essentially disproved that, but we couldn't believe it, you see. So we had to explain why, oh yes, you must still take your carbohydrates because they're still going to work. But we couldn't conclude that because that wasn't what we did. But to get the paper published, we probably had to add that. Okay, so. But now if you go back to the 1940s and 50s, this was one of the greatest runners of all time, Jim Peters. He reduced the world record in the marathon by 7 minutes. 7 minutes in 3 years. And it was really interesting because he came about at the end of the Second World War. He was a great runner. And this is what he said: we were still rationed for meat and none extra could be attained. At the time of the 1948 Olympics, we were given extra meat and received food parcels from overseas. But in 1952 Olympics, that had stopped. The only thing that could be done was to try to make up with extra bread and potatoes, and look what he says, which is probably not the best food on which to run over 100 miles a week in training. This is the opinion of the 1948-1952 runner. And this man, you read, he trained hard, he really trained fast all his life. So we forget that. We've got to go back to the 50s and see what people were eating. And I've spoken to them. Ron Clark, who died recently, I asked him, he held 17 world records in Australia. I said, do you ever carbohydrate load? You know, we just ate normal food. So now the carbohydrate story comes in the 1960s because they developed the muscle biopsy technique, and I'm sure that Fred will talk about that. But then along comes Stephen Phinney, and he does this study. And he concludes from this study, he adapts group to a high-fat diet, and he said 4 weeks of adaptation to the ketogenic diet resulted in no change in endurance performance. That's not quite true, because here are the data. And what the data show that in some people, exercise performance, this is the ketogenic diet in the darker color, went up dramatically, for 84%, 30%, and some it dropped dramatically. So what he should have said, there was a biphasic response. Some responded incredibly and some very poorly to the diet. That's what the conclusion should have been, but we were all blind, of course. He was blind at the time as well. He influenced me, and we did our own high-fat diet study, published in 1994, so we would have started thinking about this in the late 1980s, and we found an effect. We found a big effect on performance. So here we were, a group that adapted to a high-fat diet or a high-carbohydrate diet, and they did 2 hours of exercise, and then they had to exercise at a fixed work rate for as long as they possibly could. So they started depleted, muscle glycogen depleted, and then they exercised for as far long as they could. And guess what happened? The group on the high-fat diet had a much better performance. So, but this is now 1994. Do you think it changed my mind? Not one iota. Completely ignored it. That can't be true, you see. So that's what happened. And then at about the same time in the 1980s, after I had read Stephen Phinney's work, Paula Newby-Fraser phoned me. She's a South African who was training for the Ironman in Hawaii. And she phoned me and she asked for my advice. And it turns out she became the greatest triathlete of all time. She's called This Is Why. She won 28 Ironman triathlons, including 8 world championships in Hawaii, and she was named the triathlete of the millennium. She asked my advice in 1984, and she said, Tim, should I increase my fat intake? I said, yeah, go, please. Yeah, eat fat, must be good for you. I never said go low carbs. Never said that, because, of course, I didn't believe it. But she misinterpreted it, and she followed the low carbohydrate diet. And when I met her, as I do every few years, that's what she said. She said, the most important determinant of my success was what you told me, the diet you told me. So that was really interesting. And then she said, you can't train for the Ironman on pasta and salads. And look at her, and there it is. I mean, she is a lean paleo athlete, you can see, or paleo, well, low carb anyway. You know, that she hasn't got the insulin roll, which we'll talk about this afternoon. And she's muscular. And today at 50, she's in unbelievable shape. So that was the one woman. But at the same time, who was the best athlete was Mark Allen. And Mark Allen was funded by the carbohydrate industry. So what he said was restricted. He had to be very cautious in what he said, but he would at least say this. He said, I didn't do well on a high carbohydrate diet. It seemed like it was too low in protein. I personally needed a little more fat than Pritikin. Pritikin was the original low-fat diet, was saying. So I didn't really tell people how I ate. because it was so contrary to what was popular. For me, the 40% carbs, 30 protein, 30 fat, I don't believe he ate that. I think he ate less carbohydrate. But anyway, that's the story. So there we have the two greatest athletes, and Mark Allen was a competitor for 14 years. And I think that's relevant, because I think if you want to have a long career, you'll find it's the paleo diets athletes who have the longest careers, as Paul and Newbeat had, Fraser had, and he had. Now, I fortunately went to the Hawaiian Ironman in 1998 because Gatorade weren't funding it that year, so I could be invited. Okay, which is another story, because of course I was still promoting carbs in those days, but I was promoting less drinking and saying Gatorade was doing naughty things and so on and so forth. But I asked the question why the Ironman triathlon is impossible, because from our biological studies in the laboratory, we couldn't understand how a guy like Mark Allen could run a 2:39 marathon. 2:39 marathon at the end of a swim and a cycle. So biologically, it is impossible. But it's only possible under one condition. And we'd never been able to measure that condition in the laboratory. So let me show you what I mean. If you want to run 42 Ks in these different times, that's your VO2, how much energy, oxygen you'll need, your percentage of VO2 max, and that's the energy requirement, kilojoules per minute. And these things are actually remarkably accurate. They may be out by 5%, but so what? That doesn't matter. So now we can work out that from our laboratory studies, we've had people cycle for 4 hours, i.e. we've repeated the cycle of the Ironman, and when they get off, we can then calculate what's their physical condition, what's their metabolic state. And if we then make them run a marathon, this is the state that they're in. And we know that they can burn a certain amount of energy from oxidizing blood glucose, a little bit from lactate, and much more from fat. So to get your 58 calories, you have to burn fat at about 0.76 grams per minute. Now, these are fixed because you pretty much run out of glycogen and you've only got the liver producing glucose for energy. So the person now, if he wants to run a 2:40 marathon, as did Mark Allen, or let's say he wants to run a 3-hour marathon, he's got to burn fat at 0.91 grams per minute, because this is fixed. Can't change that. And to run what Mark Allen wanted to do, you have to run and you have to burn 1.2 grams of fat per minute. And in our laboratory, we'd never found those high rates. We'd got up to like 0.8, 0.9, but never up to 1.2. So the question becomes, could Mark Allen burn 1.2 grams of fat per minute under those circumstances? So that's, if the metabolic model of fatigue is correct, in other words, fuel's terribly important. The difference between running the final marathon on 2:40 versus 3 hours 30 would be a 51% greater capacity to burn fat when body carbohydrate stores are depleted. So the question is, can humans oxidize fat at 1.2 grams per hour during exercise? And remember, that's going to allow this guy to run a 2:39 marathon, which is quite fast. You know, not many of us can run a 2:39 marathon. So what we did, this is the first study we've done, and it's about to be published, and it's the first study in the world where we looked at glucose production from the liver. So we isolated the liver, but I'm not talking about that today because that's another story. And this work is due to be published quite soon. And we looked at a group who'd been on a low-carb diet for at least 13 months compared to a mixed diet for 107 months. And it can show you can see what they were eating. The low carb were eating 50 grams per day. The mixed were eating 394 grams of carbohydrate. And you can see the fat intake was 230 grams versus 120 grams. And these guys were mildly ketotic versus those. So we had them exercise in the laboratory for 2 hours when we studied their metabolism. And this is what we found. So this is the mixed group oxidizes carbohydrate about 3 grams per minute, and the low-carb group at about 1.5 grams per minute. But the fat oxidation is about 1.2 grams per minute. That's the highest values yet reported publicly. There are some other values. So we got it. We got the 1.2 grams per hour that we were looking for. And notice what's really interesting, that although in the carbohydrate group their fat oxidation goes up, this group, it's high right from the word go, which is really interesting, that your fat oxidation should be so high the moment you start exercising. And this is the total energy that the guys burned, and you can see on the high-fat diet, you burn mainly fat. Look at that. That is astonishing, how much fat is being used and how little carbohydrate is being used by a group of highly adapted athletes. And this is the muscle glycogen, which is also really interesting because muscle glycogen is not zero on low carbohydrate diet. It's actually quite reasonable. And it's much higher on the high carbohydrate diet, but after 2 hours, guess what? They're the same. Now the question is, let's say we extend this exercise here. What happens to the high carbohydrate group? They're metabolically crippled. They're metabolically crippled because they can't burn fat. I showed you that slide. They can't burn fat. Let's go back. They can't burn fat. The fat's stuck there. They can't burn more fat. They've got no glycogen. What are they going to do? So technically, they're in trouble. So this is quite interesting, an interesting study. And what you really need to do now is to see what happens thereafter. And unfortunately, we haven't done that as yet. So the prediction then is, so fat-adapted can oxidize fat at 1.2 grams per minute during exercise. As a result, most humans can perform most forms of exercise just burning fat. That has to be the conclusion. And so is that why we store so much energy as fat? And that's my conclusion, that humans are designed to burn fat and that we have converted ourselves to carbohydrate-burning metabolic cripples by eating so much carbohydrate. Okay, now I'm going to say that's the one point. Now I'm going to talk, I know Fred's going to talk about elite athletes, and I'm going to show you some elite athletes who do this diet. I've given you some examples. But I want to talk about the average person, and that's what you have to understand. So the previous lecture talked about the metabolic syndrome and made the point, as I believe, that all those diseases are the same. They all result of insulin resistance. So the disease of insulin resistance is not this. Those are the symptoms. The disease is this disease. And the point is we all lie somewhere on this curve. And Fred, I'm convinced, probably sits right up here because he's so lean. And if he's either eating a high-fat diet and not telling us, or he's carbohydrate tolerant. So he doesn't have the problem that I have. I sit at this end with type 2 diabetes, highly carbohydrate resistant. And if you are carbohydrate tolerant, you can do what you like. And I suspect that the world's best athletes probably are highly insulin sensitive and can burn more carbohydrate and probably need to burn more carbohydrate to run really fast over 800 meters, 1,500 meters. I don't contest that I guess those guys are highly insulin sensitive. But once the event goes longer than 2 or 3 hours, I think the story changes. And if you sit on this end and you eat all the carbohydrates that I told you to eat, then that's what's going to happen. You're going to get type 2 diabetes like me. So that's terribly important, and that's what we forget. We don't individualize the diet for the individual athlete. And so it is absolutely criminal to tell an athlete with insulin resistance to eat a high carbohydrate diet because they will get type 2 diabetes. So let's move on. So remember I showed you Bruce Fordyce winning the Comrades Marathon because I told him to eat lots of carbohydrate and we thought he would be fantastic. Well, a few years later, he's not looking so great. He's got the metabolic syndrome, okay? And he's on the high carb diet. You can see he's got a bit of a belly and he's got terrible legs and he's got fat on the back and so on. So we convert him to the high fat diet. And this is him looking, and this is with Zola Budd, one of the great South African athletes. He's just finished the Comrades Marathon, which here he finishes in 5 hours 30. Here he finishes in 10 hours. And here he finishes in 7.5 hours at the age of 55. He now runs 5 kilometers in 18 minutes at altitude at the age of 55. He's looking amazing, okay? So there's a classic insulin resistance story for you. And so I caused his metabolic syndrome, but I also saved him in the end. But here's one of the best examples we've ever had. This is a guy who looks like your typical Dutch marathon runner. But he's not Dutch, he's South African. And this is him struggling near the end of a 56-kilometer race. He's still got 20 kilometers to go, and he's in survival shuffle, means he just gets the one foot just in front of the other. And he finishes the race in almost last position. And he eventually asks me, what's the problem? He says, I've just run 9 marathons in 9 weeks, and I've put on 3 kilograms. So he said, clearly the exercise isn't helping. I tell him, Simon, you're insulin resistant, you've got to go on a low-carb diet. So we debate it, and he's reluctant. Anyway, he says, I'm going to try for 100 days. So after the first week, he's lost 2 kilograms. He says, geez, this was amazing. So in the end, he loses about 12 kilograms, but the key is he starts running more and more and more. Why? Because he loses the flab around his legs and he doesn't chafe, you see. So now he can train 120 kilometers a week, which he's never done in his life before. And the next year, this is 1 year later, remember, this is what he looks like now. 1 year later, this is him finishing the race. He's 3 hours faster. 3 hours faster. So here's a guy eating a high-fat diet that's going to kill him and give him coronary artery disease, and he's done so much better. So the last team we converted was the Australian cricket team. And there were 4 players on this team who have admitted to converting, and I don't know how many others have converted. But I want to introduce you to 2 of them, and this is Shane Watson, who struggled all his life with obesity. Well, not with obesity, obviously. He said, I always had to starve at the start of the season, and I was convinced I was always going to be fat. I said, Shane, tell me about your father. He's got type 2 diabetes. And he said, absolutely. So this is an Australian father, Australian cricketer, unable to control his weight using conventional methods, family history of type 2 diabetes, weight control effortless on a high-fat diet. He says amazing. Getting up and eating steak and eggs for breakfast is just amazing. Now, the other chubby guy on the team was a guy called David Warner. And David Warner was the chubby little guy on the team. And now look at this. Okay, there's no metabolic syndrome. He just scored 100 runs, which is... And up to May last year, he was the world's best cricketer. And he said the change was also astonishing. I've increased my energy. It's helped my recovery. I'm not out of breath when I run between wickets when batting in cricket, which is interesting. That's an interesting observation. So, and then if you're watching the Rugby World Cup, Australia are one of the competitive teams. I think New Zealand probably win, but Australia are going to come close. And they're going to come close because of this guy. And this is our player, who's one of our great players, but this is David Pocock. And David Pocock, there's a whole story, and I'll take 10 minutes, so I can't tell you about it, but actually he's a Zimbabwean like myself. And he wrote to me a few months ago, and I'm almost done. Okay, sorry. And he wrote to me, so the point is, if you're watching the Rugby World Cup, watch for number 7 or number 8 Australia. If Australia win, it's because of this guy. He's special. And this is what he said. For the past 3 years, I've been following a diet based on Weston Price and Sally Fallon's work. And after seeing your work on banting, I finally decided to give it a go about 6 months ago. I'm feeling fitter and stronger than I ever have. And he's playing brilliant rugby. And this is a guy playing at the highest level and is now on the banting diet. And he was also insulin resistant. So now I've given you some of the background. Now let's look at what the science is. And I've just got 2 more slides to show you. Well, Jeff Volek and myself and Finney did a review, which was published, and I think we published it on the website. And we looked at the studies of low-carbohydrate diets, and it turns out there are only 11 studies. You ask, why is only 11 studies? Because there's no industry that's going to fund these. There are probably 11 studies a month on carbohydrates. So there's publication bias. It's very important to understand that. There's so much data on carbohydrates and so little on fat. And of these studies, very few are long-term studies. They're like a week study adaptation. 3 showed significant positive effects, 4 a non-significant effect favoring the low-carbohydrate group, 2 no effect, and a further 2 showing a clearly negative outcome. So, but there has to be real concerns about placebo effects, because you can't hide the placebo effect when you're doing a high-fat diet. So it's almost impossible actually to do this research, except if you're studying metabolism. But if you're studying performance, very, very difficult. But if you looked at those studies, you'd say there's no evidence to say that a high-fat diet definitely impairs your performance. And there's no evidence to say it definitely improves your performance. But this is the key, and this is what we forget. We forget that sport is not just a laboratory time trial over 100 kilometers in a laboratory. That tells you so little about sport. There are no studies the effects of low-carbohydrate diets of ease of weight control, and I've shown you how easy those guys found it controlling their weight, capacity to train, and ability to recover from training. These athletes, when they adapt, like David Pocock, will tell you that I recover more quickly. From a bruising game like rugby, I recover more quickly. Their immune function and injury risk and their hand-eye coordination or capacity to concentrate in sports like golf and cricket. And that's what the cricketers tell us. They say it's much easier to concentrate now because I'm not getting these glucose insulin spikes all the time. So the point is that that's what research needs to do. We can't just study people in a laboratory over a 100-kilometer time trial. My belief is that athletes who adapt to this diet will train better. They'll perform better because they can train and recover more effectively. Because, as the previous said, they're not immunologically compromised and they've not got this inflamed response. And it's clearly premature to conclude that all athletes in all sports must be eating high carbohydrate diets. And my main emphasis is the long-term negative health consequences of high carbohydrate diets in persons with insulin resistance must be considered. And that, I think, is critically important. That there may be people for whom a high carbohydrate diet is very good for their performance, but I believe they're the minority. I believe that insulin resistance is the most prevalent condition in the world, and therefore we have to be very cautious about telling everyone blanketly to eat more carbohydrates. Thank you very much for your attention.
It is with great pleasure that I'm here. Tim and I know each other for a very long time. We have been frequently in the American College of Sports Medicine meetings with lectures, etc. So he is really a good old friend. As Tim, I like to challenge opinions. And related to opinions, the question is, what is the background of the opinions? Now,
you have to stay between the lines.
Between the lines. Okay. Now, a few things. I have a few disclosure slides. I'll go rapidly through it. Yeah. It says that I'm neither a high carb nor a high fat promoter, because you may have the impression that Tim is a high fat promoter and I am a high carb promoter. That is not necessarily true. I believe in appropriately mixed diets, 40-45% carbohydrate and the same amount of fat for the general population. Yeah? Let me be clear about it. I follow certain paleo principles if it goes about eating fresh food, fish, etc. Nothing wrong with this. And I discourage the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages while accepting milk and fruit juices, but only small quantities. Let me be clear about that. Industry. This presentation has been made without any involvement of the industry. What I stand for here is truthful interpretation of what I see as good science. The opinions are based on currently scientific available data as far as accessible to me, and I have no conflicts of interest. Let me be clear about that. Since interpretations are very often too absolute and overdone, and I'll give a few examples. Fructose is toxic, gluten makes you fat, carb-free makes you lean, wheat is genetically modified, the paleo diet was fat-rich always, relative sugar intake has dramatically increased while fat was reduced, causing obesity. Dried meat is the best energy source for power. The ancestral diet was fat-rich. Yeah? Now, my question is always on such opinions, is this true? If yes, is it based on anecdotal evidence, or what are the data and how good are the data? And if there are no data, why aren't there data? Now, we have been challenging views in 2 papers, Does Wheat Make Us Fat? And 6 Misconceptions About Dietary Fructose. And now it's my pleasure to challenge Tim on the high-fat diet for athletes. And the question is, low-fat, high-carb diet for all, or the other way around, or just balanced? That's a major question, because the high-fat diet has in fact come from the area of syndromics and people that have diabetes, improving lipid oxidation while keeping blood glucose low, which is good for people that have insulin resistance, and has moved into athletic sports. Now, the question is what is going on there, because I am asked by sports organization, Olympic athletes, about what is on in here. Now, there are very many conflictual data. One is that we see that if you look to very recent meta-analysis of carbohydrate absorption, that you see a link between sugar-sweetened beverages and overweight, type 2 diabetes, etc., but not between total carbohydrate. Now, that is strange, so there must be a confounding factor. Another thing is that we have consistently thought that carbohydrates make you fat. But if you look to the data of all the large cohorts in the world, and you see here big studies, and you look to carbohydrate percentage of total and body mass index, then you see if you increase carbohydrate intake, it is related to less body mass index. And these are big trials with hundreds of thousands of people in America and in other countries. So it is not so simple to say carb makes you fat. Maybe refined carbs and sugar-sweetened beverages are the culprit. Now, low-fat, high-carb diet for all. In the 60s, 70s, obesity was thought to be the result of fat intake, advised to reduce fat and focus on carb-rich diet. The developments in food industry, however, made a wide variety of products available that are high in added sugars and fat, while low in fiber. As a result, dietary advice did not have the desired effects, because people simply got all those foods with added sugars. Since late 90s, the advice is to reduce carbs and sugars and eat more fat. However, despite a fall in added sugar consumption, there has been no decrease in obese prevalence, neither in diabetes prevalence. So despite the fact that sugar consumption is declining, we see that clearly, in obesity and type 2 diabetes are further increasing. So it's not so simple. What's going on here? Now, observations. The observed level of total calories is too high and leads to chronically positive energy balance. And we see that whether people have a very high fat diet or a very high carb diet, that is about calories. If you gain weight, you develop insulin insensitivity. A step further, you develop insulin resistance. A step further, you are diabetic. You have cardiovascular disease, etc. We consume a bit more of everything, all being non-significant but cumulative, leading to a positive energy balance. Now, what's written here in blue, I will not further explain, but in the discussion, I can show you the data. Sugary drinks are related to about 15 to 20% unnoticed calories in our satiety system, creating a positive energy balance because you eat 15 or 20% more of the next meal than you should eat because you have not seen those 15 to 20% calories. Along with decreased physical activity levels, less energy expenditure, and reducing any macronutrient intake will lead to weight loss being more favorable, however, when cutting carb than cutting fats. So if you are going on a lower caloric diet, cutting carbs are better than fats. But at eucaloric levels, if you have the same amount of calories, and that's where Tim says, yeah, that's where science comes into account, the effect is less effective. And yeah, there are data on that, and I can show you the data, but calorie for calorie, cutting fat in the diet is less effective than, or cutting carbs is more effective than cutting fat. Lipid and fat as an exercise fuel, let's put things into perspective. We talk about high fat diet, but what is high fat? Is it 50, 60, 70 or 80%? A very critical question. The same is for high carb. What is high carb? Is it 50 or is it 60, etc.? If we look to sports type, we have to look at the type of sport and the situation we are in. And then we deal with muscle fiber type recruitment, activity, fuel needs, and muscle and whole body recovery needs. And it's very, very critical to say that. Tim, in his last slide, it is premature to make a recommendation that all athletes should be on a high carbohydrate. I would say it is proven that not all athletes should be on a high carbohydrate diet. At least that's what I say. I once had to deal with soccer players, and I counseled the Dutch soccer team and other teams, and I talked about the second half and being able less to sprint because of fatigue and related to carbohydrate. The goalkeeper thought I have to drink a huge amount of carbohydrates to be fit in the second half. His insulin was so high that he fell asleep. Yeah, so not for every athlete, there are clearly differences. These type of sports, I call them go-rest types of sport. A tennis competition may last 5 hours, but the active playing time is maybe 1 hour of the 5 hours. So there's a lot of rest in between. This sets totally different requests for the fuels that are required. Now what we know, if you look to muscle fiber types, is that we have slow twitch fibers. They are for, I'm standing here, continuously activity, or if I do very long work. And there are fast twitch fibers, and the fast twitch fibers, they produce more force, and you need them at highly intensive exercise. Ultra endurance athletes hardly use these because they are not recruited. There is no reason for that because they are not sprinting. So what you must know that depending on the exercise, the fiber types that are involved in the exercise are specific. And what you see is that the recruitment of these fibers are related to intensity here, expressed as percentage of VO2 max. Now, if we go to endurance, and we have been dealing with the athletes, we have done measurements in the Tour de France in the late 80s for 3 years, We did measurements in the Alpine Marathon in Switzerland, which is very, very long. It's longer than a marathon. It's 56 kilometers. We have done measurements in the Himalaya, and here you see very long distance swimmers. And you can think that if you're swimming and you're swallowing water, it's not easy to drink carbohydrate. And if you so it's better not to drink anything but to go on. And maybe fat then is a much better source, and that's the same for Alpine Marathon. The same for these athletes that are so tired that they can't run anymore. But it may be different in sports that are of shorter duration. Now, if you look to the muscle fibers, then here you see that the type 1, that is the slow twitch, the one for the endurance exercise, and this is the very fast twitch. If you look to glycogen and intramuscular triglyceride, and you see the lipid is here in this endurance type of fiber, but not in this fast twitch fiber. And if you look to the potential, oxidative potential, here it is high, there it is very low. The glycolytic potential here is low, and there it is high. It is fiber specific. If you look to next slide, then you can look to the enzymic adaptations. And you see here the slow fiber and the fast twitch fibers. And if you then look to the mitochondrial density, mitochondria, you need to burn the lipids, to oxidize the lipids, and the carbohydrate is very high here. It is intermediate, it is very low there. The capillary blood flow density is also different. And of course, there is a link to intensities. And then you see this is more than 75 here listed, and more than 40% of energy expenditure. Now, if you look to production of energy from fat to carbohydrate, I often make the comparison diesel car and a racing engine. And you know, a diesel you can drive terribly long, but you can't if you want to have power. Diesel is not really good. You need super fuel. And we have that with ATP. We have that with carbohydrates from glycolysis, glucose and lactate. We have it from the oxidation of glucose and the oxidation of fat. And here you see the flux in ATP, and then you see the flux per second of time is the lowest on fat, and the highest on, of course, the energy-rich phosphates, and the carbs are higher. So if you are in very high intensive exercise, lipid may not deliver enough ATP per second of time, and you automatically shift to more carbohydrate. Now, these studies have been done. Tim has done many. We do many too in Maastricht. And you see this is really, I mean, they work very, very hard. We take muscle biopsies, and in the muscle biopsies we can analyze the lipids, the fats, etc. And based on these studies, there's not a plot of us, but a very recent review in Cell Metabolism of Egan and Zirath. They made a plot here that if you look to lipid oxidation and to carbohydrate oxidation, then you see the higher the percentage of VO2 max, the lower the lipid oxidation becomes, because there is a shift automatically to carbohydrate because of energy flux reasons. We have looked into that in terms of athletes, what happens here, and I'll show you a graph here of the study we did with Wagenmakers. And you see plasma glucose here is high, here it is low. So this is high carbohydrate, this is low carbohydrate. Here the lactate is high, it's low. And if you look to the workload, yeah, the percentage of maximum is here 70% VO2 max, and you see on the carb they can maintain it throughout time. On the lipid they can't, and exercise drops to about half of exercise capacity. Now, the same you see at the same time, despite the fact that serum fatty acids increase incredibly and also the ketones increase significantly, but somehow we are not able to use them. And that has led to a suggestion, well, maybe if you can improve fat oxidation by training, you can work on that. And I'll come to that. Now, if you then look to meta-analysis that have been done recently, Stellingwerf 2014, and you see the percentage increase in performance versus placebo, and placebo is then always the not carbohydrate trial versus the carbohydrate trial. We know if you don't ingest carbohydrate, the fatty acids go to a much higher level, the ketones also, but despite you see that if you have increasing exercise times, there is an increase in performance related to carbohydrate intake. Now, very recently, and that brings me to a study that was done some time ago, and that is a curvilinear response of various amounts of carbohydrate. You see here the details, but what I want to show is this graph. And what you see in this graph is that if you have a certain exercise time and a time to completion, the faster it is, the better performance. There is a dose response of carbohydrate. If you have carbohydrate amounts, then up to 40-60 grams you have improved performance. If you go beyond 60 grams, you get a deterioration of performance. And the reason is that you then have so much carbohydrate that you get gastrointestinal problems and that hinder your exercise. So you see that there is clearly on these meta-analyses there are performance effects. Now, boosting lipids, would that be advantages? And we have done such studies also as Tim has done. Can you ingest fat during exercise? And we use medium chain triglycerides because during exercise they go immediately into the blood and they are carnitine independent to go in the muscle cell. It didn't work. Ingest lipid-rich meals during 3 to 4 days prior to exercise to keep insulin low and enhance lipid oxidation. It did not work. Incorporate periods of high-fat diet to adapt to increased lipid metabolism along with normal mixed diets. Now, one such a study, Tim showed one after 2 weeks of adaptation. I show here another one after 15 days. And in his own lab, the ingestion of the high-fat diet significantly altered substrate utilization, so there was significantly more lipid oxidation. But did not attenuate the 40-kilometer time trial performance. There was no effect on time trial performance, no benefit in that study. Now then you can say, if you look to ketogenic diets, could you apply long-term high-fat diets very low in carb, and that means less than 20 energy percent. And these are based on assumptions of keto diets, mainly driven by Volek in the past and by Finney. And there are a few statements here. Carbohydrate drives lipid metabolism, keto diets boost lipid oxidation and performance, and winning ultra-endurance runners prove the concept. Now, let's look at a few things.
The fact that carbohydrates drive fat metabolism. This is data from a controlled feeding experiment that we recently completed where we literally fed people all their food for 5.5 months. Every 3 weeks they switched diets, and you can see we initially dropped their carbs down to very low levels and then progressively increased their carbs. And what you see here, this is respiratory exchange ratio. The lower the value here, the greater the fat burning. So you see right off the bat, you see when we restrict carbs, fat oxidation increases. As we reintroduce carbs, you see decreases in fat oxidation.
Now, he says carbs drive lipid oxidation, they inhibit, etc. But you could say exactly the other way around, because we say, well, yeah, that favors your concept, but the other way around is also true. If you make more lipid available in the bloodstream and you look to what happens, then you see an insulin-stimulated glucose uptake in muscle and oxidation, insulin and contraction stimulated. There is a reduction of the glucose metabolism with high-fat diets. So here you could say lipid drives carbohydrate oxidation. I want to show you that because you need to look from 2 angles. The marathon is too short for these guys, he says himself, because in the marathon you don't see effects, but for these guys in the ultra-endurance there are effects.
We've currently tested 9 low-carb athletes and 4 high-carb athletes on our weight to 10 and 10. But you can see their age here, mid-30s, pretty lean guys, don't have a whole lot of body fat. High VO2 maxes, but not extraordinarily high. But these guys they're running races, triathlon and beyond. So marathon is too short for these guys. They have to be exercising for like 8, 10, 20, 30 hours.
So he says marathons are too short for these guys. So in his reasoning, he makes a distinction between the clear ultra-endurance and the very high-intensive shorter sports. Now, what he also says, and that has been criticized, that if you look to endurance athletes, we know that many endurance athletes, they have VO2 maxes of 75 and above. Here it was just around 60. And we then say, well, that's fairly trained, but these are not really endurance athletes like you see them in top competition in highly intensive endurance sports. Related to the performance test, he shows this slide.
Now,
or he goes into, I will skip this, but he shows a comparison that they oxidize more lipids, and that has been proven in many trials. Fat oxidation, you start to oxidize more lipids, but then does it bring really a performance benefit?
It's not just competing, he's winning and setting records. And it wasn't an anomaly. He came back the following year and won again in 2013, just this last July. A little bit slower, but this was the second hottest race in their history. It was 108 degrees in some parts of the course. It's absolutely phenomenal what these athletes do. And he's not the only low-carb athlete. It's this last race, 3 out of the top 6 podium finishers in the men's and women's class were low-carb athletes.
Now, 3 out of the top, yeah? Number 2 was on a high carbohydrate diet, and number 3 too. So how selective are you in finding the arguments that fit your theory? And I think for a balanced view, you need to look at both sides of the medal. I would say a single person and winner is no evidence in scientific terms, not even in competition terms. Our top cyclists who would win the time trial in the World Championship just this week, he didn't make it. He became 5th because he had a hurting ass and he couldn't cycle well. Now his oxidation, his performance is very, very good, but the form of the day and the complaints you may make a very, very big difference. Now if you look to does high-fat diet help improve performance, then you see a number of trials that were listed earlier by Finney and co-workers, and you see the blue arrows here are all in favor of the high carbohydrate, 94%, 54%, 60%, 76% in terms of exercise performance. And one study was better the other way around, better on the high fat diet. Now, here you can say, they said, you see, we are the first to prove that. They could also have said, why is our data different than all the other ones? Because they show the opposite. And if you look to the performance data, you see those here, and you look to the individual times, then you see that, and Tim showed that slide too. 2 people are better on the carbohydrate diet, 3 are better on the high-fat diet, but 1, according to modern science now, if you look to more than 2 times the standard deviation, is outlier, and you should not consider in your statistical analysis. This person went from 148 minutes to 232 minutes, and I think that form of the day that has influenced either or, yeah, the bad day or the good day. So this is criticized, and it is said, well, this is in 5 people, that is no science. Then a slide has been plot forward to look at fat oxidation, one from Venables, and I'll come later to that, based on 300 people, and the one from Finney and Levine based on 5 people. And you see the keto-adapted people have a much higher fat oxidation than the other ones. But what does it mean? And I'll come to what Asker Jeukendrup says in this respect. He said you can't compare this one to the other one in one graph. The study design is totally different, the training status is different, the workload is different, the diet has been different. This was treadmill exercise, this was cycle ergometer exercise. You can't compare them, so you cannot put them in one slide as evidence. Ketogenic diets for fat loss and exercise performance benefit and safety. Bente Keynes recently published with Arne Astrup, or it is in press or it is just out. There are numerous randomized controlled studies showing that ketogenic diets effectively reduce fat without causing excessive loss of lean body mass, so that's good. The crucial question is if or how these diets influence sport performance. And then she goes on to say the evidence suggests that an increased fat availability transfers into higher rates of whole body and muscle lipid oxidation. That has clearly been proven during standard submaximal aerobic exercise. However, despite greater rates of fat oxidation, these diets consistently fail to improve endurance exercise compared with carbohydrate-rich diets. And then I do not talk about the ultra endurance. I talk about up to 3 hours very, very, very intensive exercise. Cox and Clark, recent work has proven that the classical glucose-free fatty acid cycle is inadequate as a model, as working muscle becomes increasingly reliant on glycolysis, independent of carbohydrate or independent of free fatty acid availability, and that's what I showed in this dose-response study. The rigid preference by muscle for carbohydrates during exercise reinforces the importance of muscular and hepatic glycogen stores for powering sustained energy exercise. Current nutritional practice in exercise performance advocates the exogenous supplementation of carbohydrates to maintain glycemia. Yet the question then is, how much is that? Is that 80% of daily intake carbohydrate, or is that selectively around competition? And I would say it is the last. Yeah. So I will skip this one. World-class marathon runners, because this is anecdotal evidence, and Tim showed a few that are nice. I'll show you one that is nice. Kenyan runners are all on a relatively high carbohydrate diet, and they are world performance, aren't they? Nobody would say they're not. 2 years ago, David Gabriselassie was promoted as a runner who preferred low-carb, high-fat diet after all. Recently, he has clearly stated that he stopped doing this, having realized how important carbs are to maintain human running power in a marathon close to 2 hours of running time, so very, very intensively. He still follows paleo principles, but now with more carbs. Now, then I come to the conclusions, and these are my conclusions. That's why it says Brouns 215. Starvation metabolism or ketosis may be useful as short-term training principle. Go for a week ketogenic diet prior to competition and then go into competition. Has just been published by Lane, one publication related to this principle. A positive role of ketosis during competition at more than 70% VO2 max is questionable, simply because the ATP generating power of fatty acids plus ketones is much less than fatty acids plus glucose. Despite the early criticized study of Folek 30 years ago, no proof of performance benefit is available until today. There are anecdotal statements of athletes, but that's no evidence. Conclusion 2. Long-term effects of long-term high-fat diets, and that is more than 60 energy percent, remain to be proven. A balanced diet comprising 40 to 45% of fat, same amount of carbohydrate and about 10 to 20% of protein, may be the best for endurance athletes overall in events lasting up to 5 hours. Carbohydrate intake during such events, 40 to 60 grams per hour maximally, will help delay fatigue, thus support performance best. Now, yet, long-term high-fat diets are unpalatable and not practicable to most athletes. They are difficult to maintain. Don't underestimate that. They have not been shown successful for elite endurance athletes in intensive endurance sports, but may have theoretical benefit for ultra-endurance runners. And then you must think about 100K runners, long-distance swimmers, mountaineers, race across America, Mount Epic Desert, all these famous, very ultra-endurance, yet to be proven. So there are athletes that say, I feel better, but there are others that say that I feel better on the carbohydrate. What we need to do is clearly well-designed studies to compare that and then say, this is true or it's not true. This is my last slide, and I look forward to an interesting debate. Tim?
Yeah, there was quite a lot of information there, so it's difficult to put out all the things I disagree with or agree with. So we agree on insulin resistance. I think Fred mentioned that was important. I think his understanding of what causes obesity is a bit simplistic in that so I'm now going to go on to the negative side. Sorry, I also agree that in high-intensity exercise, there may be a role for carbohydrates and insulin sensitivity. So the people who are the best athletes, I suspect, are insulin sensitive. But you have to remember, you see, when you talk about the Kenyans, what about the Kenyan who's insulin resistant and weighs 2 kilograms heavier? No one ever talks about him. You only talk about the elite guys who win the races. But that elite guy is highly selected. There may be a number of Kenyans who are obese or marginally obese, they're 2 kilograms overweight and are not winning races. So one of the problems about talking about anecdotes. Fred's understanding of obesity is wrong because he gives us the calorie in, calorie out model, and that is not the model. The model is what happens to hunger, and I'll talk about that tonight, this afternoon, is what drives hunger determines whether you become fat or not on a diet. And it's not calories. It's if you eat fat, you lose your appetite and you eat fewer calories, and that's critical. And that's an important point. He's also wrong about sugar consumption going down. The sugar industry has driven that story. It's not true. The analysis of what's happened in sugar intake is biased profoundly because they're not actually measuring how much sugar is being taken in sugar drinks and so on. So the data has been hidden, and you have to look at what's called the Australian paradox, where the Australian University of Sydney, which is funded by the sugar industry, has said that sugar intake in Australia has gone down while obesity rates have gone up, and that is not true. The Australian sugar intake has not gone down. It's because of the way they're measuring it. So he made a point about that. The other point I would make, he showed a slide from Wagenmarker's own data, 1991 American Journal of Physiology, but this is the classic problem that we didn't understand when we were doing that research in the 1990s. We biased it completely because we took athletes and we put them on a low carbohydrate diet for 7 days, and that's a disaster. All of us know after 7 days, very few people have adapted properly. And of course you feel terrible and you perform poorly, and that performance was appalling. If you compared the two, you had to know that there was something more than just diet going on there. So, and that's why we talk about people who've adapted for 6 months. That's, you have to do those studies. And I think my biggest problem is that all the studies he quotes are on people who've only adapted for a few days. All those studies, and they say there are no studies showing the beneficial effects of a high-fat diet. In fact, there are. I showed you there are at least 3 which show a beneficial effect, but no one talks about them because they're just inconvenient. And I'm not suggesting those were brilliant studies, but there are studies in the literature showing high-fat diet did help performance. Another point that has now just been thrown out in the last week is the study showing that at high energy expenditure, at 100% VO2 max, you don't burn any fat. That is nonsense, because you can't measure it. And you can't measure it because the methods we use are dependent on you being in a steady state condition. And high exercise, 100% VO2 max, is not a steady state. And the steady state requires that your CO2 stores in the body are not affected. Now, when we exhale CO2, we take some of it comes from our internal body stores because buffering of acid and so on. And so your CO2 will always be increased abnormally at high intensity exercise. And if you use that, then you use the respiratory quotient to calculate how much fat's being burned, how much carbohydrate's being burned. It is always going to be against fat and pro-carbohydrate because you're exhaling carbohydrate. So therefore, the RQ goes up abnormally. There's a study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine this week, or last week, where they did it differently. They got athletes who were relatively good or relatively poor at sprinting, and they made them do repeated sprints, and they measured their oxygen consumption and their respiratory quotient. And they concluded the following, that the better sprinters in the group were better because they burnt more fat, not more carbohydrate. In both groups, the carbohydrate production was the same, but the guys who were running faster were burning more fat. Now that completely destroys that article, that slide, showing that at VO2 max you use 100% fat. They also showed that fat oxidation predicted VO2 max, whereas carbohydrate oxidation didn't. The athletes who burnt more fat had the higher VO2 max. Again, that's completely contrary to what we believe. And it's because of this error in measurement. The whole point about science is you must know what you're measuring. And if you're measuring respiratory quotient at high intensity exercise, it will not tell you what you're burning as a fuel. So that's crucial. And there's all these studies suggesting at 100% VO2 max you're burning 100% carbohydrate, and they're simply not true. And there is a role for fat use at high intensity exercise. Then we got onto the anecdotes. Sorry, just to make the point about the anecdotes. The importance of anecdotes is that they show what's not true. We say you have to have a high carbohydrate diet. These anecdotes prove that's not the case. They may not prove that you have to have a high fat diet, but they certainly prove you do not need a high carbohydrate diet to perform in these races. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, well, let me see where to start. So, I clearly stated that anecdotal evidence is no evidence in terms of science. You know, an athlete can perform better on one day than another, depending on totally other things than truly is related to metabolism. Tim showed a slide where I really didn't agree with his reasoning. You remember that?
What were the points where you did agree?
Oh, where I agreed. Okay, sorry. I will turn the other way around. I agree with a number of things, Tim. If you say if you're diabetic and your insulin resistance go on a low carb diet, yeah, clear. I'm 100% support it. I also agree that when he says, well, this one graph, the green line went down to 0 fat oxidation, that cannot be. I agree on that. That cannot be. This is a plot from that paper where they have just as an example made this graph. Of course, if you exercise at 100% VO2 max, you burn also lipid, not only carbohydrate, because there is a participation of slow twitch fibers. But independent of that, the lipid oxidation goes dramatically down. It goes not down to 0, but it goes down. He says RQ is not a clear measure. We know that respiratory quotient gives an indication. If you really want to measure, you must measure fluxes. We do that across muscles. We take arteriovenous blood and venous blood across muscles. And then we look to fluxes of carbohydrates and lipids based on labels, on stable labeled lipids, fatty acids, and carbohydrates. And there we come to clear results related to lipid and fat oxidation. There was another point where I agreed. I agree that on the long exercise or low intensity exercise, low fat diets may prove to be useful. I disagree with the fact that for all athletes, high fat, low carb diets are beneficial in terms of performance. My reasoning there is the same as with carbohydrates. Carbohydrate intake is not required for all athletes. It depends on the circumstance. You must put it into perspective of the exercise duration, the intensity, and the training status. And then some athletes we advise to take clearly carbohydrate. Others we say you can go to a lower level, take more dietary fiber, you may have a little bit more fat, etc. Now, then I come to where I didn't agree. Tim showed one slide where you saw after 2 hours the carbohydrate oxidation was down and the fat could still supply energy. And he said, well, if you extend that, you can't burn carbohydrate anymore because it is not there. Yeah, that is a theory that you can't say that, because after 2 hours, if glycogen is gone, if you exercise longer, the exercise intensity goes down and they will not have less glycogen, the same glycogen level as after the 2 hours. They will automatically burn more lipids because of the lower exercise intensity. So that jump, for me, that is a too easy jump. Let me see. Yeah, you refer to the study I showed from your lab, where you said 14 days is no effect. That is too long, and you can't show that data. But in your own presentation, you showed one slide after 40 days that did show an effect. So then you can't show that slide as well. Let me see. Okay, I stop here.
Okay. Now we will try it without. So far it was. Oh, I was good to hear. It was. I think we are. It's possible to do it without microphones for the last 10 minutes. I have one question to start with for you, Tim.
Yeah.
Fred is saying that if your VO2, if your intensity is above 70%, let's say, then high fat will not be sufficient. And I wonder, can you surely comment on that? Is it possible even at that high intensity to? Is he doing?
Yeah, I don't think he said 70. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I would say 85, 90. That probably would be about right. Because that's nonsense. I mean, the study we did was at 70% VO2 max, and you can burn a huge amount of fat then. So, and that is the Ironman triathlon intensity is about 70% for VO2 max in the leader in the Ironman. So theoretically, the Ironman would be able to do it on fat alone, not with carbohydrates. Yeah.
Okay. Short reaction.
Well, as you said, with fat alone is the same as if in my slide if you have all carbohydrates, zero fat doesn't exist. So fat alone doesn't exist either. You always burn some carbohydrate.
Yeah.
But we clearly see in highly intense exercise, carbohydrates play a role. And you showed one statement. One of your anecdotes was on, let me see, I made a quick note here. Well, one of the people that I don't know where I left my. Oh, here they are. You said, let me see, Mark Allen on a high-fat diet, and finally he said his favorite is 40-30-30, so still 30% of carbohydrate. And that's why in the beginning I said, well, if we talk about high-fat or high-carb or low-fat, low-carb, what is the percentage? And very often that is poorly discussed.
Okay, good point.
Yeah.
Short reaction.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Mark Allen ate more fat, but that's because I know Dr. Phil Maffetone, who advised him to change to a high-fat diet, didn't prescribe a 40-30-30 diet. And I think Mark was influenced by his funders. So the question was, what's a high carbohydrate diet? My view is that 200 grams of carbohydrate a day is the maximum you need at whatever sport you're playing. And I'll tell you why, because when we studied those athletes who are high-fat adapted or high-carbohydrate adapted, the high-fat adapted athletes do burn quite a lot of carbohydrate during exercise because they've got this fabulous liver that generates all the carbohydrate they need. But during the rest of the day, their RQ is very low and they burn fat. If you eat a high-carbohydrate diet, let's say over 300 grams a day, most of the carbohydrate is burned not during exercise, it's burned during recovery and the other time of the day when you don't need it. So that's why I think that the high carbohydrate diets are excessive, because you're only burning it during the day when you don't need it. And I think 200 grams of carbohydrate is more than enough for any athlete at any distance. So a high carbohydrate diet for me would be, let's say, 20%. 20% carbohydrate.
Okay.
That's a high carbohydrate diet.
Short
Yeah.
one.
Well, I would say, again, you need to put things into perspective. So if Tim says 20% carbohydrate is enough for most of the athletes, I would say I don't believe in that. I see clearly decrements in performance in high-intensity athletes, and then I talk about soccer playing with a lot of sprinting, etc., in between rests. But in the second half, they are glycogen depleted. They have problems maintaining power, and that is where fat doesn't help. If you say, well, still you can boost lipid oxidation, and that is what all the others also say, Bente, Kienzenberg, and all, they say all the same, we boost lipid oxidation, but not under all circumstances, this improves performance. And if you then say longer-term adaptation, and that is since Volek 30 years ago, 1983 was the first publication, this is criticized for this performance benefit because of one outlier. 30 years have passed, and since then there has not been a single study showing that at high-intensity exercise, lipid burning, enhanced lipid burning leads to a performance benefit. So, I wanted to say that.
Okay, so now Fred's put his foot right in it. Okay, so I was waiting for him to say that. So why he's put his foot in it is because he's described his model. And we all have a model, and that's what we believe how the world works. And his model, sitting in his head, is that glycogen depletion causes fatigue. There's no evidence for that at all. He did say that. He said, what he said was that when he deals with elite soccer players, they become tired in the second half because they're glycogen depleted, and the lipid can't be oxidized fast enough. What he doesn't understand is exercise performance is regulated by the brain, not by the muscles. And if you slow down in exercises because your brain will not recruit the muscles, that's the key. If I was to offer those football players $1 million to sprint the last 10 minutes of the game, they would all sprint the last 10 minutes of the game. They choose not to sprint the last 10 minutes of the game because they're thinking about, I've got another game next week, and I've got another game the week after, and that's called pacing. But pacing can be overridden if you appeal to the brain of the athlete during the exercise. And that's the problem in all the research we do, that the thing's being controlled by the brain, and we think it's being controlled by what's going on in the muscles. And then we try to explain it all by glycogen depletion and you can't burn fats. And that's simply not proven.
Okay. One question for Fred, because Tim, I think, was presenting new data, not yet published, so that is difficult, of course, to
No, hold on. Because Jeff Volek published the same data, because I just reviewed Volek's paper, and it will be published quite soon.
Okay.
So Volek has done the work, but we've also done the work.
Okay.
So it is too. But did you notice how critical he was of Jeff Volek? And you have to ask, why?
Well, exactly the same, because you say, well, it is in your head and you're thinking concepts. Jeff Volek defends his view by data that is in mind and is his concept of keto diet. And there I say, with many other scientists in the world, the evidence is not there. So show us the performance data. And if you then show that cricketers that have an extremely low VO2 max and do not spend a lot of energy are performing better, then I say, well, that's nice, but it is along the same as ultra endurance athletes. Where are the toppers? And I perceive you never worked with soccer team, but I did with the Dutch soccer team over the years. And I know the problems in the second half.
Okay, well. So there are a couple of anecdotes there. The top English team and the top Scottish team are on the paleo diet.
There you go.
So, but I mean, but that wasn't the point. Now I forgot what my point was. Yeah, what were we discussing?
You wanted to have the microphone?
No, okay,
but we were discussing the data that
no, sorry. Fred and I used to be carbohydrate funded, by companies, and so we only did carbohydrate research.
Oh no.
And then I broke away and then started doing high-fat diet, and guess what? You can't find any funding for high-fat studies. Absolutely, there's none at all. I challenged Gatorade and Jürgen Drop of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute to fund a study of high-fat diets. And they won't. They absolutely won't. And unfortunately, if you read my book, Waterlogged, you'll see the influence that industry has on scientists and what we believe and what we can say. So Fred quotes a whole range of scientists who have been studying high carbohydrate diets for the last 30 years. And they're not about to change their thinking. For many reasons. Firstly, they lose their funding. And that's why there's so few high-fat studies. We did one where we had guys cycle 200 kilometers in the laboratory. And the benefit was beginning to show in those athletes. But unfortunately, we only had 7 athletes finish the trial. And do you know how many people you need to do a proper clinical trial on performance? You need 100. You need 100 athletes to do a clinical trial. Now, who can afford that? So even the studies that have been done for carbohydrates are underpowered, dramatically underpowered. So that's the problem. So my point remains that when Fred says there haven't been any high-fat diets done, or there haven't been enough of them, and we haven't proven they work, he's correct. But there's a publication bias here, because it's so difficult to raise the funds to do high-fat studies. Yeah.
And is that changing now? Because
No, not at all. Not at all.
Why not?
Because the industry is so powerful. Well, I'll tell you.
But there's a
Go to the American
there's
College.
a layer of industry right now.
Yeah, no, I agree that, and they haven't done it. You go to the American College of Sports Medicine, and you go to the European College of Sports Medicine, and you see who the funders are. There would not be an American college, and there would not be a European College of Sports Medicine if it wasn't for Gatorade. Yeah.
Well, he said I'm right. You just said, there's no money, so the study has never been done. If I say, well, if the study has never been done, you cannot claim that the performance benefits are there, because there are no data. That's one thing. Second thing, Ben de Keynes and her group, they did a long-term fat adaptation study. They proved significantly increased fat oxidation rates, just as you see in all other studies. But the performance was on the other side. There was no benefit of performance. So studies have been done on fat adaptation. They are there, but they show no performance benefit. Now, the last publication just out a week ago from a lab in Australia, they looked to keto adaptation as a principle of starvation metabolism over a period of a week, because we know that 7 days is sufficient on the keto diet to boost performance. And we also know that if you go on a longer-term ketogenic diet, that if you supply carbohydrate anyway later on, you're not able to use it. Yeah, and we don't understand why, but that's what we see in carbohydrate fluxes. So long-term keto diet, that's where we put big question marks for elite athletes performing at very, very high intensity.
Yeah.
So moderate intensity, I believe in it. A swimmer who is going to do 200 miles, I say go on fat, because you can't have the carbohydrate. If you're in the Himalaya they have to carry all the stuff and carbs that they need to is weight. So take care that your liquid oxidation is good. Then you have a better benefit. I believe in there, but I don't believe in the high intensity exercise. And you can say, well, they still can burn fat, but I clearly showed you data that the fast-twitch muscle fibers and the intermediate muscle fibers that do a lot of sprinting work at higher powers are hardly possible to burn any fatty acid. So, and those need carbohydrates. We see that. And yeah, Fritz discussed so very nicely about the brain, but I've seen last week data on glycogen in the brain, and we see that even the brain has glycogen to maintain glucose for brain activity, and if we exercise, the glycogen goes down, and just as in the muscle, the glycogen comes up again afterwards. So there are clearly links, and the question comes back to what is high, what is low. I think people can go on high-fat diets, but still need to have about 25, maybe 30% of lipids to have a long-term sustainable diet for most of it.
Tim, you want to share for it?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I'm very happy with that.